to open the event. Thank you.
Your Excellency Limpo Namge Tsurin, Minister for Finance, Honorable Jarin Uduk Sembagu, Senior Vice President of the Republic of Palau, Your Excellency Limpo Tashidoji, Chairperson of the National Council of Bhutan, Ms. Kani Ugranaraja, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, Honorable Limpos, Dashos, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning. I warmly welcome you to the Asia and the Pacific Regional launch of the 2022 Human Development Report. Premised on the powerful idea that people are the real wealth of nations, UNDP conceived its first Human Development Report, or HDR, in 1990. This year's HDR is the 31st edition of the report, entitled Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Our Future in a Transforming World. This year's report examines how inequalities and uncertainty are reinforcing one another to undermine our sense of control over our lives. The report comes at a time when the global community is still grappling with compounding challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic, it's still there, a climate emergency, conflict, rising inflation that is causing a global cost of living crisis, and increasing stress on mental health. The pandemic exposed existing tensions and weaknesses of our systems and institutions that continue to be tested time and again. The Human Development Index has experienced unprecedented reversal, 2 years running. People feeling less secure and less certain. What is happening to us? And how do we reverse this trend? Today, coinciding with the International Day of Democracy, Bhutan is privileged to host a regional launch of the report for the Asia and Pacific region in the presence of our regional director, Ms. Kani Ugranaraja. Bhutan, being the host for this event, comes with specific, very special significance. 3 years and 6 months ago, in this same auditorium, our UNDP administrator, Mr. Achim Steiner, had a dialogue on rethinking development, advancing human well-being, and protecting the planet. This dialogue took place immediately after Mr. Steiner presented the special award for recognition to His Majesty for his leadership in advancing human development, well-being, and happiness for all Bhutanese. As an incoming resident representative of UNDP to the Kingdom of Bhutan, I was ever more convinced that Bhutan has a lot to offer to the fast-evolving global discourse on development by showcasing the importance of taking a long-term view of development and putting people at the heart of policies and programs. This year's Human Development Report promotes the application of 3 I's: investment, insurance, and innovation. The Tendel, an online citizens engagement platform to be launched later today, is an example of all the 3 I's in application. And I like to also advocate for adding one more I: inclusiveness. Tendel is a platform to ensure citizens, especially young people, remain at the heart of policy and program making processes. Inclusivity will help strengthen the trust between institutions and the people where lack of information and engagement have contributed to a greater sense of uncertainty. For those of you joining from outside Bhutan, let me share that we understand Tyndall as a force with good wishes coming together. It's a bit like an aligning of stars to achieve a common goal. I feel that today's event is a result of the collection of all these forces with good wishes coming together in the spirit of true partnership and a sense of optimism, even as we face headwinds. During last week's global HDR launch, the former President of Ireland, Madam Mary Robinson, said, "What if the best world is still ahead of us?" Well, the report paints a rather depressing picture. This is indeed the time for us to be collectively crafting a narrative of optimism and hope for us and for future generations to come. I hope with the support with the Tyndall, we will be able to put our hearts and minds together to rebuild trust, to save our people and planet, and achieve SDGs. Today, we will also hear from Ms. Wignalajawa about the key messages of the Human Development Report, and we will discuss the implications for the Asia and the Pacific region with a panel of distinguished individuals. First, Honorable Jaren Uduk Sengbagus Senior, Vice President of the Republic of Palau, Professor Salim Huk, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and Mr. J.D. Cruz, CEO of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I'd like to thank the Royal Government and the Royal University of Bhutan for hosting this event, as well as Ms. Wignadara, Honorable Limpos, Dasho Kinley, and members of the panel for being part of today's program. Once again, thank you all in the audience for joining us this morning. Kadinchera and Tashidele.
Thank you, Azusa. We are indeed going through some challenging times across the world and here in Bhutan. Our next guest has first-hand experience dealing with some of these challenges. He has a wide range of experience working in the Ministry of Health, the World Bank, and as well as the World Health Organization. I now have the honor to invite His Excellency Finance Minister Nimbo Namgyet Singh for his keynote address. Thank you.
Kuzambula, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening for our guests who are joining virtually and following in different time zones. Excellencies, distinguished guests, a representative from our development partners, ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all express my immense pleasure to be here this morning to attend this very important event, the regional launch of the 2022 Human Development Report titled Uncertain Times and Unsettled Lives. I would like to thank the United Nations Development Program Resident Representative, Asuza Kubota, for her warm words of welcome and outlining the importance of the day. I would also like to further extend my greetings to all the guests, those in person and those joining remotely online. As a part of my keynote address, I will touch upon two key areas of a human development in relation to gross national happiness concept and a human development index in Bhutan and our country-based challenges. Let me begin by looking back in the history. The 1990 landmark Human Development Report articulated the concept of human progress with the foresight statement that people are the real wealth of a nation, and that the fundamental goal of a development is to create an enabling environment for the people to live long, healthy, and creative lives. The 1990 development decade became a turning point to shape the developmental discourse from economic-centric to a human-centric. This notion of human development resonates so well with the Bhutan's development ideology of gross national happiness. Simply put, both have the multidimensional perspective towards the development, and both rejects the idea of a relentless pursuit of economic prosperity and the growth at the expense of non-economic dimensions of well-being. For Bhutan, the gross national happiness have been the unifying force behind the country's policies and the plans for decades. While we initially struggled with the conceptual methodological problems of quantifying GNH, our continuous attempt consequently led to the formulation of Gross National Happiness, GNH Index. But we have more work to do to keep our Gross National Happiness Index befitting the changing context of the time. We now use the GNH Index to better assess and monitor the societal progress across 9 key areas, from mental health, psychological and spiritual well-being, to relational well-being in the communities, to creativity and cultural diversity, to health, education, living standard, governance, environment, and even the time used to prevent overworking or sleep deprivation. Over time, the GNH Index have been able to capture the global attention, and like the Human Development Index, it is championing the cause of an alternative form of measuring development. Since 1990, the Human Development Index ranks over 188 countries, creating a potential base for comparative study with other countries. Bhutan's Human Development Index value has gradually doubled in the past 3 decades, and today, Bhutan is ranked at 127th out of 191 countries, which with the Human Development Index HDI value of a medium human development. Since 1990, the life expectancy at birth has increased from 53 years to 70 years now. Expected years of schooling has also increased to 13 years. Similarly, Bhutan's Gross National Index per capita has accelerated almost 7-fold. While we may have had a steady rise in all the 3 HDI indicators on health, education, and income, as a nation, we continue to face a myriad of complex challenges. We are still resource-driven, dictated by limited resources, making our economy volatile and vulnerable. We need to prioritize and pursue a productive-led growth to ensure that it's more resilient, inclusive, equitable, and accessible. And now, having shaken by the pandemic, just like any other part of the world, and further aggravated by global economic uncertainties, the challenges are diverse. Hence, human capital development is inevitably the driving force to keep ourselves abreast of the future uncertainties. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I must say that report we are launching today, titled Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Our Future in a World in Transformation, is a fitting title given the challenges we are experiencing today. We are facing multiple problems manifested in various forms and intensities, from ongoing COVID-19 pandemic to worsening climate impacts, from a devastating humanitarian crisis to rising inflation, including political and economic turmoil. The report rightly recommends doubling on the human development to help us navigate the future and unleash people's potential to be an agent of a change. Policies that focuses on investment, insurance, innovation will enable people to thrive in the face of uncertainties. So it is reassuring to witness a rise in Bhutan's HDI score, despite the immense challenges we faced as a nation over the past 2 years. I must say the pandemic brought with it some of the greatest lessons that we wouldn't have dared thought about. It taught us to be more agile, adaptive, and innovative to be better respond to the crisis and to come out stronger and resilient. With the stringent COVID containment norms to respond effectively to the pandemic, we quickly learned to be more adaptive to the use of digital technology for various forms of community services. We got an opportunity to bring in the transformational initiatives to address several structural issues in the governance. While I agree that pandemic has disrupted lives, livelihood across the globe, we must learn to use this as an opportunity to sit back, relax, and think through to reset our button to make this world a much better place to live. With the rapid pace of development in the digital innovation front, we must keep ourselves updated with the required skills and talent to innovate rather than being a mere consumer of the innovation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, human development agenda is key for successful post-COVID recovery. In conclusion, I would like to recognize UNDP for continuously advocating human development and pushing governments to consider and include the voice of people in the developmental agenda. We hope the report launched today will spark an insightful discussion about the future of the world, evidence-informed policymaking, growth and development in the region. I thank you and Dashdile.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for highlighting the importance of human voices, human well-being, and development in the changing times, and also highlighting how GNH resonates with the Human Development Index. Our next speaker is an expert on sustainable development. She has over 25 years of experience in this area. She has deep knowledge of Asia and the Pacific across policies, programs, management, and operations. I have now the pleasure to invite UN's Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for the Asia and the Pacific, Ms. Kani Wignaraja, to highlight key messages from the Global Human Development Report 2022.
Good morning, everyone, and to Linpo Namge, thank you so much, and all the Linpos, Dashos, Excellencies, my UN colleagues, and dear friends. It is very special for me to be back in Bhutan. My first visit here was almost right out of graduate school, so I have seen many changes in this country, and you will understand why I'm was very keen to have the regional launch of our Global Human Development Report here in Bhutan. I will take you through a journey that begins in darkness, so you have to please bear with me, but we will walk together towards a light. And I will be making the case that Bhutan, again, as it did a couple of decades ago, in its transformation, will be showing us a new way forward again. So let me start by saying that in this world of uncertainty that we are living in, you see a global population that is burdened by anxieties and worries that we had never really measured at this level before. And many people across the world, interestingly north and south, in all of the surveys done for this global report, do not believe that they will be able to give their children a better life than the one they have lived. And that is saying quite something. That is a dramatic statement. This report argues that human development should seek to expand the richness and the hope of people's lives, not just our economies. Next. This slide to me, sorry, the previous one, please. This slide shows that 90% of countries saw their Human Development Index decrease in 2020 or 2021. Now, this is 4 times as many countries that fell back as they did during the global financial crisis of 2009. Just think about that. This decline is unprecedented in the last decades since we have been measuring human development. Now, it also shows that recovery is very uneven among countries and regions. For our region, in fact, South Asia is the biggest hit. Next. Now, for the first time in 32 years, as you can see, when we have been measuring and calculating human development, the global index has dropped 2 years in a row. This is also unusual. Usually we see a drop, and then you see countries realizing that and picking it up the next year. Not this time. We have now fallen back to 2016 levels of human development, which means most of the gains on SDGs have been reversed in these last, that we've made in these last 5 years. Next. Now, the report argues that even uncertainty, because we're not unfamiliar with uncertainty, but uncertainty has changed. So we are entering a new phase of what is driving uncertainty and worry in our lives. And this means that the future increasingly defies prediction. At least prediction that we have tools currently to understand and do something about it. So what do we need to do to focus on and manage our progress with these new levels of uncertainty? Next. Now just think that in November this year, and I'm talking 2022, the world will reach 8 billion people. 60% who will be living in Asia. So if we're going to address some of the challenges, we have to understand where the big effort has to be going forward. And the report picks up 8 areas where investment is essential and changes in policy and institutions are essential. There are others, but let me just pick some of these and speak to 3 of them to make the point. First, today, just look at poverty. 1 in 10 people live in extreme poverty. Not just below the poverty line. I'm talking extreme poverty. Now, COVID-19, we think, the estimates show that close to 100 million people were added to that poverty group. Look at the area of sanitation. We should think that by now, with all of the science and technology and infrastructure, we could have handled this one. But 1.7 billion people still lack access to basic sanitation. And more than half of this group lives in Asia. And the last one I'm going to pick up is inequality. Both inequality of income and of opportunity. Just ask if 1% of the global population today owns 50% of our assets. We are doing something very, very wrong. And when you ask people, even poor people, what they feel most strongly about, it's interestingly, they don't say being poor. They say it is injustice. And this we have to reflect on, because this is a deep part of the anxiety and stress and that sense of being unsettled that we are seeing around us. I would actually like to add to this, for me, a very key area, but I see it as underlying all of this, is education. Many people ask me, if you had one last dollar, where would you put it? And I always say, in girls' education. Next. Now, we have, as I said, always lived with uncertainty. There has been disease, there have been wars, poverty is not a new phenomenon. But today there are 3 layers that have added to this level or intensified this feeling of being unsettled every day. The first is the extent of destability of planetary pressures. We have so messed up and destroyed our environment that building this back is going to be critical. Now, I have to say that as Bhutan, you have to be proud of having protected your environment, and I hope this is a key part of development progress going forward. The second is there is a tremendous need to move and drive societal transformations. Now, this is not always for the better. So these societal pressures and movements can be both for the good, but also can be very hurtful. So how do we move it more to being the good for all and not just for the few? And related to that, the report picked up across these surveys increasing polarization of views of how we distrust each other and just the anger that the world is feeling right now. Next. So as we lurch from crisis to crisis, we feel like we are firefighters, and without the right tools to firefight, unable to tackle the real roots of these troubles that are bothering us. Next. So this report didn't start this way. It's interesting that it had to shift gear to relate to the responses and feedback that the data and the surveys that were done globally were picking up. So if we were picking up a huge level of stress, for the first time, a Human Development Report really went into a range of issues and indicators that I would even say for us was very new ground, somewhat uncomfortable ground for development agencies, because you don't really have hard data and hard evidence behind it. But we had to take the leap. So it is an unusual report, and I hope all of you do have a chance to keep reading it. It's quite a hefty one, but it's really worth the read. Because you will see that even before the COVID pandemic, 6 in 7 people worldwide were feeling somewhat insecure. And this now has intensified. You can see that the evidence also shows in this slide that stress is linked to inequality. And you see the differences by levels of education. So when, for example, Bhutan says we've got to rethink education and what our children are learning and what our adults are learning, you can see a direct correlation with the societal anxiety and stress that can be eased. And then you can see that insecurity compromises our ability to rise to challenges and be part of the change. And this is mostly among the young generation. So I would say there's no point going through massive reforms if we're not going to be addressing the underlying societal anxieties that people are feeling. Next. Now, this is to me very dramatic, that 1 in 8 people, no matter where you are in the world, suffer today from some form of mental or emotional health disorder and feeling a record level of sadness. Now this, just think about this, that it is as though the whole world is in a global depression. And if we are going to, if you feel that way, how are we going to be part of a change? We must address this if reforms are to take root, because otherwise, really people just feel no desire or capability to be part of that change. Now, women, if I look at, next slide, please. Now, women, people with lower than tertiary education, and those who are unemployed report much higher levels of absolute worry and stress. So again, you can see the correlations very strongly. Next. Now, what we see here is as devastating as what we're doing to our environment. And that is a widespread, growing polarization across countries and regions in the world. And this is very real for us in the Asia Pacific as well. So we're sitting on a tinderbox that can be lit on fire at any time. So we shouldn't be surprised at a war going on in Ukraine. A lot of things pointed to the fact that we are sitting on these volcanic eruptions that can happen at any time. Next. Now look within our own societies. This uncertainty and levels of insecurity are also driving divisions among groups in our own society and affecting our ability to just talk with each other. Usually, even at the height of conflicts around the world, countries, people had spaces for dialogue, and these are shrinking. So this is why also, as Linpo Namge said, one of the key things to keep investing in is those spaces for engagement and dialogue. So I very much like the idea also that we add inclusive as very much a part of the I that we will come to. Because this graph shows, and the numbers behind it, that more and more people want to hold extreme positions. You are either for or against. Very little balance in the middle. Next. So the report then says, if we know some of this now, including all of this that is in front of us, why are we not making some of the key changes that are actually in our control? Let me take an example. We know we have to reduce fossil fuel emissions, yet they rise year on year. We know that tackling inequality is critical to answer a lot of these questions, and yet the gaps keep growing. Next. So this is where we come to navigating and heading towards the light, and what we can do together to help each other, help our countries, and help the world move in this direction. So policies and actions that focus on the right investments, on insurance and innovation, and as Azusa said, let us add here the fourth I, inclusion, will enable us to thrive, to grow, even with carrying a level of uncertainty. For example, the investment into renewable energy and into education brings high returns. We can see that insurance, including social protection, but also universal health care, prepares our societies for pandemics and national disaster calamities. And innovation in many forms, both technological but also cultural, societal, helps us to anticipate better and be ready. Now, I have to say the traditional approaches to public policy, particularly to finance and to education, are still so rooted in the past. And I think here you can see some of the reforms that Bhutan's leadership is trying to move forward with. For institutions that particularly manage these areas do have to change and change very fast. But the area that we are uncomfortable with dealing with, because we don't have economic tools to do this with, is to ease this mental distress and societal anxiety that has built up this psychological worry. And if we cannot address this, what I would call humankind's sense of depression, then none of the reforms, the change really will make things better for us. So next slide. So this is where things can be addressed if we look at what really drags us down. And it is the power of empowering people, including at very local levels, and connecting people through networks and social movements that are a positive reinforcement to change, so that they feel in control, not just of their lives, but where their countries are headed. We have to understand, therefore, that the old data and the evidence is not enough to change people's minds. We must widen our understanding of human behavior to recognize the roles that emotions play, that cognitive bias and culture plays. So I have been saying to my team, no more standalone reports and studies without understanding the intent that change actions must bring about in very fundamental ways. So now let me turn to our responsibility as the UN and as UNDP. Next. We must double down on human development investments. This means human capital and human security investments as the highest priority. Second, we must help countries accelerate the transition to renewable energy and protecting our biodiversity. Third, some of the old economic models are so broken. It was growth for the sake of growth and only benefited a few. But we do have new economic models and policy options that expand choices and opportunities, including sources of financing that make sense for many more. Fourth, anticipatory governance models, including at subnational levels, will be critical to connect these dots and have more people feel engaged in where their lives and the lives of their countries are headed. And they also must feel that they're global citizens. Bhutan has hardly this is a carbon neutral country. But if every citizen of the world can do what this country has done, so Bhutan for the world is showing that it's not just doing this to save Bhutan, it is doing it to save the world, almost from mankind. And finally, new and extended partnerships with youth, women's networks, social movements, not in the old ways that we partnered, but in addressing this collective anxiety, worry, and sadness, to shift gear and to pivot to a sense of being a stronger feeling of agency and true happiness, which comes from also being more empowered and making your own choices. So last, and let me close by saying that ultimately, with the last slide, next, to navigate uncertainty, we have to look beyond just improving wealth, important as that is. We need to protect our planet and provide people with the tools to feel more secure and regain a sense of control over their lives and their dignity. This is what will give, particularly for our young children, a sense of hope that they are in charge of their futures. It is this that will bring us back on track with human development, and it is true that the best world is indeed still ahead of us, and it is in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kani Wignaraja, for emphasizing the need to empower people while navigating through uncertain times and exploring opportunities in this changing and uncertain times as well. So to celebrate these opportunities, may I now request Your Excellency Finance Minister and Regional Director and Mr. Zusa to come forward for the launch of the Global Reportler. Thank you, Your Excellency. May I now request Your Excellency Limpo to kindly join the audience. Now we would like to look into an animated HDR explainer, a video to provide a brief context on the findings of the report.
The last 2 years have had a devastating impact for billions of people around the world. And for the first time, human development has declined for 9 out of 10 countries around the world. These challenges are hitting us at the same time and interacting to create new threats and make us feel insecure, unsafe, and untrusting of each other. This is the world today, in which we know what obstacles we face, but seem paralyzed from taking sufficient action. To break this impasse, we must double down on human development to tackle disadvantages and support people's empowerment. We must also recognize and treat the global mental health crisis that undermines human development, and recognize the polarization that is more deeply dividing us, making collective responses harder. Uncertainty has unsettled our lives, but it can also broaden our horizons. It can challenge us to rethink what was once thought impossible, to chart a new course for humanity. Policies that focus on the 3 I's can be powerful tools. We need to invest in the capabilities people need to thrive. Ensure so that everyone is protected in an uncertain world. And innovate technologically, economically, and socially to respond to whatever challenges come next. We must re-examine assumptions to develop a wider set of policy options needed to navigate uncertainty, to unlock human potential, and to protect the planet, and provide people with the tools they need to feel more secure and have hope for the future. This is human development. There is promise and peril in uncertainty. Tipping the scales towards hope is up to us.
We now have the highly anticipated panel discussion moderated by Tanshu Kinle Dorji with our esteemed panelists from the Asia and the Pacific joining us online. Tanshu is a journalist and a writer who has also served as the Secretary for Ministry of Information and Communications, currently an editor at Druk Journal. Tanshu, may I request you on the stage, La?
Thank you. That was a heavy morning. The messages that we've received. Honorable Finance Minister, Madam, UN Assistant Secretary General, and UNDP Regional Director, Asia and Pacific, Myanmar, in Bhutan, Bhutan. Now, very quickly summarize what we were listening to all morning, the presentation. You know, the intersecting challenges of COVID-19, meaning the COVID-19 economic crisis and climate shocks, kind of reversing human development. I think that is the message in short. And 9 out of 10 countries are suffering from this. Various degrees of devastation. Okay. So all of us here and around the world, I think we all have a sense. We know what it means by now, by uncertain times, unsettled lives. And the UNDP, the Human Development Report, comes at a critical time because we all live in the world of worry. There's this huge emphasis on worry in the report and on the insecurities rising everywhere. So it actually reminded me of what's becoming now my favorite phrase, or favorite saying, never waste a good crisis. I think that was Churchill. So for this panel discussion, what we'd like to do is, we know the problems we're going through. Let's look ahead. Let's see what needs to be done. We have a very distinguished panel of experts from across this broad region, Asia and the Pacific, from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. We have, and they'll be sharing their various aspects of the recovery efforts taking place in the region. We have Vice President and Minister for Justice in the Pacific Island country, Palau, Her Excellency Uduk Singabao Senior. And from Bangladesh, we have Professor Salim ul Haq, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. And we have Joseph De Cruz, CEO Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, talking to us from Malaysia. So let's begin. The panelists are on with us. We'll just start with Her Excellency Uduk Singabao Senior. We asked her that we know the island nations are suffering with the rest of the world. We've asked her to some of the factors and what the region is going through and what must the Pacific region do in their recovery efforts. May we have Madam Vice President on, please?
Hello, and Alif from the Republic of Palau. It is a great privilege and honor to be part of this esteemed panel on HDR intervention, shaping future of Asia-Pacific in a transforming world. COVID-19 has had a major impact on Palau. The initial border closing and ensuing international travel restrictions caused a complete collapse in tourism, followed by a slow and incomplete recovery, and contributed to nearly 10% GDP contraction in 2020, and an estimated 17% additional decline in 2021. There has been a huge disruption to communities and households arising from the loss of employment and income. The last 2 years have been a difficult time for many of us around the globe, for our countries, our communities, and our families. This economic uncertainty is only exacerbated by Palau's acute vulnerability to the severe effects of climate change as a Pacific Island country. For our less than 20,000 people, droughts, intensifying typhoons, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and severe weather events are identified as our country's greatest risk linked to climatological events. The purpose of the 2022 Human Development Report is to measure the progress of human capacity in several relevant areas. It shifts focus away from the purely economic measures to highlight people at the center of the development process in terms of the debate on policy and the alternatives we have. This matches how development is characterized in Palau by the provision of choices and freedoms resulting in improved outcomes. While we are a small country, we value our Palauan identity and cherish our ancient culture. The Asia Pacific has made large gains since the first report was produced in 1990. For example, life expectancy has climbed from 59 years in 1970 to 71 in 2021, and the average level of education has increased. However, the past 2 years also show us that these advances can be reversed. Moreover, women and vulnerable groups, such as persons with disabilities, face challenges and delays in opportunities to continue their progress and development. The measurement of development needs to focus on the progress of our most disadvantaged and how much further we need to progress. Being a Pacific Islander, it would be remiss of me not to highlight that in the Pacific, 13 countries are covered in the analysis, and the results are as diverse as the countries themselves. According to the Human Development Index, Palau, Fiji, Tonga, the Marshall Islands, and Samoa show the best human development outcomes and are in the high human development group. The Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu are in the medium human development group, with the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. It is especially pleasing to note that Tuvalu is now included. Nauru did not have enough data available. Despite the commendable gains and improvements, people are feeling more unsettled than ever before. COVID-19, biodiversity loss, war and conflict, and the ongoing rapid expansion and impact of new technology and its impact on our Pacific traditions and practices are seeing people lose the narrative of their lives. We are seeing an erosion of physical and natural capital. Actions by governments and people have caused the diminishment of basic human rights and self-esteem. Issues relating to race, age, and sex have become increasingly polarizing, adversely affecting human dignity despite the freer flow of ideas, people, and trade. Uncertainty is more likely to generate weaker outcomes as people trade off current benefits for future investment. The challenge laid out in the HDR is whether there is a way to ensure that people feel safer, more equal, and happier. Governments, businesses, and communities have to reshape the world to redistribute more income to the poor and disadvantaged. Avoid maximizing profits that harm people, employees, or the environment. Stop unfair and unnecessary fossil fuel subsidies, and accelerate climate action in order to balance the widening intergenerational inequality. As a vulnerable, small islands developing state, Palau needs increased global action on climate change. However, we must not despair, as there is still hope and optimism for the future if we make changes now. In Palau, remembering our strong emphasis on the importance of family bonds and customary community support group systems can help reduce the risk to our most vulnerable populations. Dealing with risk is not the sole function of governments or business. Finally, there is a huge opportunity for the role of innovation and the dynamism that this will provide to society and institutions that will continue to develop and respond to the new era. I, for one, am excited to enable the ushering in of regional and global partnerships in order to improve the human experience worldwide. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Her Excellency Uduk Singabao, Senior, from Palau. Now we turn to Bangladesh. We have in Dhaka joining us Professor Salim ul Haq, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. Now, Professor, we are all talking about seeing the opportunities, we're moving to opportunities that there are through this crisis. What are some of the innovative and effective financing initiatives and that countries in the region are doing? And what else do you think must be done to get back on track?
Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me and UNDP for an excellent human development report this year. I'll make a few points in the time allotted to me. The first one, unfortunately, is to add to the list of problems that the report has already made. It uses the term uncertainties, but I'm afraid that one of the uncertainties has already become a certainty, namely climate change impacts. They are happening already, and you only have to look a little bit down the road in our region in Pakistan to see those impacts. They are because of human-induced climate change. We have already entered what I call the era of losses and damages from climate change, and they're only going to get worse going forward. Not better in the short term at least. In the long term, we can prevent even worse happening, but we are going to go into a very bad patch over the next few years, and we are not ready for it. We are not prepared for it. So we need to be better prepared. In terms of what we can do and what we are doing in the region, I think there are several very, very good examples. Firstly, let me cite my country, Bangladesh, where we are one of the most vulnerable countries to the impact of climate change, from floods and cyclones, and even we have developed a national climate change strategy, and we have been investing in building national capacity to adapt to the impact of climate change, and in particular, focusing on what we call locally led adaptation, namely working with the most vulnerable communities and decades past, whenever we had a severe cyclone, we had loss of human lives in the tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands. Nowadays, we don't have that anymore. We had a super cyclone a couple of years ago called Cyclone Amphan, which was a super cyclone at the scale of what has killed thousands of people in the past, but the death was less than 100, and they were mostly fishermen who were out at sea and did not get back to land in time. More than 3 million people on land got the warnings, went to shelters, and survived. Now, that is, I would say, one of the best, if not the best, cyclone warning system in the whole world. However, that doesn't mean that the cyclone didn't do a lot of damage. It devastated the coastal zone. It brought saline water into the agricultural land. Many thousands of people, although they survived, their lives were not lost. They were not able to go back to their homes. The homes did not survive. And they are now living in the slums of the cities in Dhaka and Chittagong and Khulna. So where we have been successful in saving lives, we have not been successful in saving livelihoods. So we have to improve. It's still a long way to go, but we are on the right track. And I would say in Bangladesh, one of the achievements have already developed a very much of a whole of society approach. We are not just leaving it to government. Obviously, government has a major role to play, but also civil society, private sector. And in terms of the potential future of how we might want to take this forward, I would like to offer my very strong recommendation, building on what we've just heard, which is that the future lies with our young people. The young are the ones, the youth, the girls and the boys, particularly the girls, are the ones who will show us the future. And we need to be investing in their education, in building their capacity, in enhancing their ability to understand these problems, and most importantly, to challenge the current paradigm of business as usual. We adults, we are not going to change our minds and our practices so easily, but our kids will do it and they will make us do it, and we can help them to do it. And so, as you may know, there is a global movement called Fridays for Future, millions of school children will be coming out tomorrow all over the world, coming out from school and demonstrating. And they are hooked up, they are linked to each other, they are working together and joining forces globally. And to me, they are potentially a much more powerful force than the leaders who will come to the annual meetings of the General Assembly in New York and the Conference of Parties of the Climate Convention. These leaders come, they talk, they don't really do much after they go home. So we should not have too much faith in them. We should certainly ask them to do things, hold them to account, but so far they have not really kept up to the scale of the problem. And my final point will be to focus on the country where you are doing this launch, Bhutan. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I am there with you in spirit. And I think Bhutan is a very, very good country to focus our attention on, as has already been pointed out, for two reasons. Firstly, you have come up with the Gross National Happiness Index, which is very closely aligned to the Human Development Index. I think we need to be pushing these indices, which are alternatives to the economic growth forever paradigm that has brought us to this catastrophe, much, much more strongly going forward. We should be doing it in academia, we should be doing it in the political arenas, we should be doing it with private sector companies. We should be pushing alternative metrics of well-being that are not just more money, more money, more money, and rich becoming richer, which is what we have at the moment. It's just not fit for purpose, and in fact is making things worse. So the Gross National Happiness Index of Bhutan, along with the Human Development Index of UNDP, these are things that we need to be promoting much, much more strongly going forward. And finally, on the point of tackling climate change, Bhutan is the single carbon neutral, or indeed even carbon reducing country in the world, and should be taken as our leader in the climate change arena. For countries that say they cannot do it, Bhutan has done it. Let us learn from Bhutan and let us promote the way that Bhutan has been able to do it by preserving their environment, their natural biodiversity, and focusing on the development of the people. These are not contradictory. We can have both. We can have win-wins on protecting the environment and not polluting and developing and in putting investments in our own people if we do it the right way. And I think that that is the way we need to be taking things forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for for sharing with us your very frank, honest views, and also helping us understand some of the real problems on the ground and who and what need to be done about it. Thank you, Professor. I'd like to turn to Joseph De Cruz in Malaysia. He's the CEO of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Joseph, we're talking about private sector investment and practices that must be redirected towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe that these have been the aims. What are some successful strategies adopted by the corporate world to incorporate SDGs, and what more can or must the business world do?
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Warm greetings to our friends and colleagues, and thank you for the pleasure and the honor of joining you in this conversation today. Let me start with the question of why and what the private sector, the business world needs to do in terms of sustainability. I think the messages of the HDR clearly describe why business strategies and processes need to be aligned with sustainability and the SDGs. Because we operate in an increasingly uncertain and risky environment. The new uncertainty complex the HDR talks about captures the risk landscape all business leaders need to navigate their organizations through. That feeling of uncertainty, of being unsettled every day, is something all leaders in the private sector, as well as in other sectors, feel acutely every day. And a sustainability-based approach helps us to mitigate those risks. Let me take examples from my own sector, where we work on sustainable agriculture and particularly on transforming the oil palm supply chain to be more sustainable. We have data that shows that oil produced according to our standards has 35% lower GHG emissions, 20% lower impact on biodiversity. But very importantly, production according to our standards also allows companies that are part of the RSPO to outperform their peers in equity markets by 24.7%, according to the last analysis we had. And when you turn to the actual growers, the families and communities that grow these crops on the ground, we have examples and analysis that show that smallholders who produce according to sustainability criteria earn between 35 and 89% more profits than their peers who produce in traditional conventional ways. So I think there's clear evidence to show that sustainability as a business strategy both reduces risk and uncertainty as much as we can, but also generates clear economic dividends for the companies and for the growers and others in the supply chain. We're also seeing, as Professor Huck mentioned, a strong push from consumers, particularly younger consumers, to demonstrate that these production systems are contributing solutions to our planetary crises rather than becoming part of the problem. And we do have many examples from throughout the business world of how companies are rethinking these approaches. But at the same time, the HDR also describes what more we need to do. The three challenges in the uncertainty complex that Kani described just now are directly relevant to our work in agriculture, for instance. Addressing the Anthropocene planetary challenge is the key sustainability issue in our sector. How do we continue to reduce biodiversity loss and mitigate GHG emissions so that we can move towards ultimately finding production models that can function within our planetary boundaries while still meeting the food security needs of our growing populations? But that path forward is often hampered by the polarization we see between countries and communities when they look at the question of sustainability in agriculture. There's a lack of a shared view of how these challenges should be addressed and how the costs and risks involved in these transitions should be shared between producers and consumers. And very importantly, the transitions we need to make in making the sector more sustainable and more efficient impact different people and different communities unequally due to the underlying inequalities, for instance, between poor producer families in the global south and wealthier consumers in the north. And as the Human Development Report says, that underlying inequality, exacerbated by the uncertainties that we are all facing, often generate perverse outcomes, even when we are attempting to move towards more sustainable practices. And let me end this opening round by giving you an example of that. We're currently working with countries in the European Union that have expressed an ambition to halt deforestation in their supply chains, to ensure that the commodities being consumed and used in Europe are deforestation-free. This is an intent and an aspiration that organizations like ours completely subscribe to. But the approach that's been taken evokes concerns because the impacts may fall disproportionately on those who can afford them the least. The approach taken by the EU requires documentation, traceability of production from the farm gate all the way through to end consumers. And the people who are least able to provide that kind of documentation are invariably small producers in remote regions. And so the risk we see is that while the intent of the EU in this case is commendable, the way in which it's approached could actually land the greatest negative impact onto those who can afford it the least because of the underlying inequalities in our system. Because these small producers in remote locations lack the technical resources and the financial resources to be able to comply with the regulatory environments put in place. So as a clear example of how underlying inequalities exacerbated by the uncertainties we operate within, can push sustainability initiatives into negative consequences, I think this is one that's worth highlighting. And we see similar challenges across many parts of the sustainability transition that the entire agriculture sector needs to go through. Things that I think even in countries like Bhutan and Bangladesh, many of you be acutely familiar with. So as we make the challenge, we meet the challenge of undergoing this transition, as we figure out how to find solutions to these global challenges, I strongly believe that the kind of analysis the HDR has put together that exposes the uncertainties that inhibit decision-making collectively and that exacerbate the inequalities that underlie many of our economic and political systems. These are very, very profound lessons we need to take into our policy making, into the decisions that we take in the business world as well as in the government policy world about how we meet the challenge of the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. We hear once more the emphasis on the inequalities within our communities, within our societies, and on the world stage. Now since we have two distinguished personalities on the stage, I'm going to turn to Azusa Kubota, UNDP resident representative in Bhutan, who's been working here for more than 3 years and who's lived with us through the COVID lockdowns and difficulties. How do you see Bhutan moving ahead in these uncertain times?
Thank you, Dasho. Of course, Bhutan has done an incredible job in managing the virus, but it has not been spared from all the factors the report talks about, factors that contribute to the sense of worry. I think nowadays the talk in town is, what do we do about the phenomenon of young people going to Australia? So we have to create a sense of hope and optimism for young people so that they would invest their time in Bhutan. We have done a lot of deep listening amongst young people. And it's not only the economic opportunities they're looking for. They would like to be engaged. They would like to have a purpose. They would like to be heard. So I think the reforms process that's happening in Bhutan, which is an example of setting Bhutan apart from the rest, taking advantage of the COVID dividend to do a real historic transformation process. This has to be also bottom-up and engaging the young people and listening to them constantly what kind of future they would like to have. So I like to commend the people of Bhutan under the incredible leadership of His Majesty for taking on this bold reform at the time of difficulty. In the education sector, preparing young people for the new and fast-evolving labor market with emerging skill sets requirements, in urbanization management, water, digitalization, and all the areas that are cut across our lives. I know there is pressing need to generate income and develop growth, which is a top priority for many governments around the world. But I hope in this process, G&H would continue to be at the heart of our reform process, that there will be no trade-off. We can still keep the interest of the people on the planet at the heart. And G&H is always about long-termism. At the time of crisis, we are compelled to make decisions that would have quick gains. But I hope the decision makers and the people of Bhutan would continue to think through long-term implications of these reforms happening here. And one area of partnership that we have been investing with the people of Bhutan and royal government is building the muscle around being anticipatory. What does that mean? Kani talked about anticipatory governance. In today's uncertain world, the only thing that's certain is uncertainty. So we have to be constantly having our antennas out, sensing early signs of changes and adapting. We have to have anticipatory budgeting, planning, ways of doing things have to be fundamentally changed. And this requires new capabilities and culture and new institutions. So I very much look forward to working closely with the royal government and people to build this new type of capabilities required to remain resilient and anticipatory at the time of uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zusa. Now I'm going to ask Madam Kani Wignaraja To wrap up this conversation, in wrapping up this conversation, can I request you to reflect on the Asia and the Pacific situation, and what is the narrative? Is there a narrative emerging for this region, particularly Asia and the Pacific region?
Thank you, and also thank you to the audience for your patience, and I hope we have provided some food for thought, but I would like to maybe reflect with maybe 3 or 4 things that I hope for the esteemed Linpos in the audience, but also who have had a chance to discuss also with the Honorable Prime Minister, and all the dashos, the young people in the audience, and my UN colleagues, that for Bhutan, but also for the region, what we see as those moments or the pathways of light that are working. The first is really that universal healthcare and universal education is an absolute must, but it just cannot be free for all. The countries cannot afford to carry this, so it has to be affordable for all. And the fact that one must not dumb down on quality in health and in education. But sustainable financing models behind this have to be critical for a country to bear the weight of carrying this from a universal point of view, but also be fair so that the poorest can access quality healthcare and quality education without being suffering for it. The second we have found, which has a huge return, is a low carbon technology, and particularly in renewable energy. This is something where the science has caught up with our ambition, and there's absolutely no excuse for not going down this pathway. The third is to de-risk investment. Many of our countries in the region are just going into very high-cost debt, mostly commercial debt, some high-cost bilateral debt, and we've got to look at this because it is an unsustainable burden that is carried. So de-risking investments and looking at the cost of debt going forward has to be something that we've got to work with you to support new debt and non-debt instruments that make it possible to make the right investments and the right choices when it comes to this. The third is, and you heard JD speak to this also, where is the responsible private sector? And in some countries, they are missing. But it is a responsible private sector that also opens up opportunities for young people. And I think we've got to look at this, including in this country, where we encourage more of that in terms of an accountable private sector that invests in sustainability, not just in their own wealth. The next to me is, and we heard this from Professor Huck so well, if we just save lives without saving livelihoods, what are people to get back to? So yes, they, we saved them from a natural calamity, but their farms, their homes were destroyed. There's no jobs, no hope going forward. So the importance of making sure that dignified, empowered livelihoods is a part of that choice and opportunity, that has an immediate direct impact on driving hope and lifting this sense of anxiety. And I think the last but not least is just being honest and having honest, open conversations on what causes this tremendous level of sadness and anxiety that the world is going through. As individuals, as families, as communities, countries, and in the world. Instead of getting polarized with such anger, the ability to just talk to each other, it's amazing how much we have not, and I think COVID took that away from us, because it took us away from each other. So I think putting that back together, the social glue that needs us talking to each other in very honest ways, trusting each other again. This investment is something we should not take for granted, and I hope is at the heart of all of our work going forward, including the deep reforms that Bhutan is undertaking right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Now to sum up, if necessary, we're talking about we've heard about the responsibilities that we all carry, and our hope that this report must not remain an academic exercise. Now, Bhutan is not a major hub in the region, but we've heard several, wise speakers tell us, remind us of the success of our gross national happiness vision. I think Bhutan will be the first to admit that it's not that Bhutan has achieved complete success, but Bhutan has a goal, has a vision. And we are today literally moving into a new era, following a vision of a transformed nation. The world, in fact, is moving into a new era, and I think it's acknowledged. It is acknowledged that everyone is affected, and it is accepted that everyone needs to move together. And here we wish, all of us wish the UNDP and the UN system the best for this formidable but potentially exciting task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tashikinle and esteemed panel members. This has been an enriching discourse around the possibilities of growth and prosperity as the world continues to become increasingly speedy, rocky, and complicated with new challenges. Therefore, it has become more important to meaningfully engage citizens in policy discourses to build a greater trust between citizens and the government. The Untitled platform is developed to promote innovative ways of linking people with parliamentarians and foster two-way communication with citizens, systematically reaching out to and crowdsourcing ideas and solutions from young people and supporting marginalized groups to proactively involved in parliamentary agenda setting and policy alternatives. To celebrate one of our many achievements between the National Council Secretariat and UNDP, I would like to invite His Excellency Lembo Tashidoji, National Council Chairperson, to launch the Untitled platform. Thank you, Tashikinle, for the panel discussion. Thank you, Lembo. May I now invite Lembo and Regional Director Nazusa to launch the Untitled platform. Thank you. This is a short clip from the Untitled platform, but a longer video will be uploaded on the platform. And we encourage the university students here to engage us with the upcoming conversation on climate, youth issues that are coming up on the website, like you all did in the last two conversations that UNDP had floated out last year and this year beginning. Now I would like to invite Namgay Chodin, a young Bhutanese who is committed to youth empowerment in policy literacy and climate action through her work in public sector. She is engaged in UN initiatives such as the Stockholm Plus 50 and works closely with the UN family to propose the vote of thanks.
Honorable Finance Minister, Honorable Chairperson of the National Council, UNDP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, UNDP Bhutan Resident Representative, Moderator, panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, here and online. It is an honor for me to propose the vote of thanks for today's program. I am no stranger to the uncertainty and transformation that the Human Development Report is about. As a young Bhutanese, today more than ever, I have come to deeply care about the future of my country as well as our planet. And I can say the same for all of us, since we all took time off from our very busy schedules to be here. Investment, insurance, and innovation are the keys to navigating an uncertain world, as the report says. Let me share 3 things to reinforce this message. First, that much of what the report mentions resonates with where Bhutan is right now. We weathered the pandemic very well, thanks to the leadership of His Majesty the King, the government, and of course the resilience of the people. But now, we need to set a new course. Our future aspirations must be achieved through openness, inclusivity, and empathy. Our institutions are also gearing up to adapt to the current contexts of the world, rather than being stuck in mindsets and insecurities that no longer serve us. We must build people's resilience while leaning into our cultural and spiritual traditions to advance collective action and strengthen our social safety nets. Second, that we must fight for the progress of problems that young people face today. The global youth population stands at 1.8 billion, the highest ever recorded in the world's history. And 60% of them, or 750 million young people, reside in the Asia Pacific. But our region also faces the challenges and consequences of poverty, unemployment, climate change, and gender inequality, to name a few. But it's also the young people who are driving political, economic, and social change in their communities. And this is where the investment part comes in. We must recognize, invest, and tap into the potential of young people. And finally, that we must end on a note of hope. Uncertainty and change go hand in hand. Change is painful because at times it is threatening and not easy to accept. But we all acknowledge that change is crucial to build a better world. Where we are going is up to all of us. This is a testament to the agency, resilience, and innovativeness of the human spirit. We must commit, act, and change today for the better tomorrow that we want. And on this note, it is my pleasure to thank our distinguished guests and audience from government and world governments, our civil society, international organizations, and students from our universities for your presence and attention. I also especially thank the Royal University of Bhutan, the Bhutan Broadcasting Service for their logistical and technical support, and the interpreters from the Wongsel Institute for the Deaf, and the UNDP organizing team for making this event a success. Thank you, and Tashdilep.
Thank you, esteemed panelists, dignitaries, limbos. Thank you so much for this enticing event. So we look forward to having such events in future. May I now request dignitaries to join the audience to take a photo, because this stage is really small. We wanted to take a picture from this side to that angle. And we request the audience to be seated, please, for the photo session. Thank you. So if the lights could be switched off, please, the lights. Yeah. Okay, so for a better picture, we wanted to have a photo session outside. So we request the dignitaries, maybe the first 2 rows, and the dignitaries and officials at the back to join us just outside the convention hall for a photo session, and after that for a refreshment just at the back. Meanwhile, if the students could be seated here while we are taking picture. Thank you. Usherers are there to usher you to the photo session. Thank you.
통낭 딩고마 치면
이루 베자투피
통나이 다벤 마치투기
통낭 디 피니
나부 지드라 슈나 델저 두첸예카 톱디데르 다진 코르비 촐레 델자이칠 닌당 첸두 에와 메파니 닌삼 곰파 게세 랄렌힌 디게 덴다디 Dewage da Jurpachu Tampi Milirimpoche di Pejamsonagi Dubom Chida Deumate Ditoba Nami Same Lakaye Impe Ditobi Disedinalu Wai Gaina Nke Dilu Tawachin Ngoshido Zunshidu Kade Beru Tawajagenam Wai, dishin imede, kashi bedab inamu. Nga disum ki dungen yomne dishi sabjani me. Wai dishin. Gajbe moche. Dishin shi devi bego bi dinda gachile tindi mo.
Ai mo senam nga devi begomi denda di mishin di gachilap suni thana chini charu chamshi chibiru chele la macho rangi sem khallo atada madawigi dungel da thina lambi gale rasu chini mato thamlam shin mindu mila senam
Gajberu sashi josh nga pape chapsagona nga shujiga lo lijime sashi lap kobe. oi dishin chegi mishibe dizumgi la di rangi misena zewela bomchi I charangaluni damparanga chilu tiwachi tige chidari charagi rashibe shisobashin che lokyo gashloni na chikishega
디디가 가데비신 때네 시딩가 메켄
mishibe gush gadim chibe chesemchi mahe pap kasha chulu kyoshin che ganimega charano somtantash
아제
kashi beda mo
마시고 마노
toto charangalni ngailap machabate dimase charabese shisobi charagi shumalumi pham pincha chardusu dunge gadebinyonime charano somtantash
오이 비마 이메데 가시뱅고 뭐체 네 아줌 대신디게 란스랑게 제디 시스노시
막 가고도 슬래시 toiga
Chitoy. Chingi na nam sumi gatoten dinumo.
magangu dinibya osi
Chingi gi makoe. Ngachigi chiro deshinje rasangi chi shisonoro.
ah
amjemu chipum digi kesara chedana mareta
ngadi bum dichindige ainzum bi nora mano ngadi gojabi yasmi kadi din namashi
야라마 nga ai mo senam dari ni ken tusum zero chembe dari chezum chimi bajin ngagi la gar zewa tenime ngagi dizumgi koleti no samrata mashibete dali phadi dizumgi ladi beni pharasha nga no sameta misunime debyoda nigi dungel lakangel di gadebesen namo
chi dungel dise tab jongora onwe rangi charo chamsho miship tom Dilinga chi luptena lulaptin pasi yuminati ansu de program da chapter len bechi kangel di senite gadeber josh ngaishimna jobe ngaishelu charo bejinge ran lutap madu gadim chi tenru dungel gadim chi nyodi beru
tablam tendi kanyel da dunyelsu seni mato di namra beru raso cheni mewo se shuni
Las ko zambola ta tari duntragi te khatangilerim ju reza popki shungra pödragi khatangilerim de pünegi gusube se shuni dedachiga lerim zinami mimal henge yonlo lerim pimi digi chödegi ko zambo se shunla ta ngache tarigi te shungra pödragi khatangilerim nalo